Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next Vice Presidential Series installment, this part 2, as we take a look at our 35th Vice President of the United States, Alben W. Barkley. I hope you enjoyed part 1, taking a look at Barkley's early life, childhood, his rise in politics. Obviously, as we touched on yesterday, Barkley had a very, very long national political career. So, pretty interesting stuff. Hope you enjoyed learning about that in part 1. And now in part 2 today, we're going to take a look at his vice presidency, his legacy, and then, of course, his very, very shocking, surprising death that you will actually hear live audio of. He was giving a speech. There is audio of this speech, and afterward, he literally passed out, and that is when he actually died. So, it's quite crazy and wild, and you will definitely hear that in this part 2. So, let's just jump right in. Part 2, 35th Vice President of the United States, Alben W. Barkley. Here we go. A remarkable upset. A dispirited Democratic convention met in Philadelphia in 1948. Yet once again, Alben Barkley was able to lift his party spirits and get the delegates cheering with an old-fashioned, rip-roaring, Republican-bashing keynote address. The demonstration that followed his speech was so long and so enthusiastic that Barkley became the obvious choice for vice president. President Truman, suspicious that Barkley, who had mentioned him only once in the hour-long speech, was trying to replace him at the top of the ticket, was not eager to have the senator as his running mate. Old Man Barkley, as Truman called him, was 70 years old, and their neighboring states were too similar to balance the ticket regionally. But since others, like Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, had turned him down, Truman agreed to accept Barkley for his running mate if the delegates wanted him. "It will have to come quick," Barkley said of his selection. "I don't want it passed along so long it is like a cold biscuit." When offered the second place on the ticket, Barkley, so often the bridesmaid in the past, accepted with pleasure and set out on a grueling speaking tour that showed he was still in Iron Man at age 70. While the president whistle-stopped by train, Barkley made the first prop stop campaign by air. He had come a long way since the days when he first campaigned for office on horseback. In 6 weeks, he toured 36 states and gave more than 250 speeches. He spoke to so many small audiences that the press dubbed him the poor man's candidate. But his strength and stamina refuted the charges that he had been too old to run. The election of 1948 proved to be the most dramatic upset of all time. It is doubtful whether there is a single American history textbook in the schools today that fails to include the famous picture of a smiling Harry Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune's erroneous headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." So in January of 1949, Alben Barkley stepped down again as Senate Democratic leader, this time to become president of the Senate. As vice president, Barkley buried whatever differences he had with Truman, and the two men got along well. Although some mutual suspicions lingered on. For years in the Senate, it had been Truman who called Barkley boss. And Barkley must surely have thought of President Truman. There, but for the spite of Franklin Roosevelt, go I. Yet in every respect politically, ideologically, and socially, the two men were remarkably alike and worked together harmoniously.
And by their actions paved Republican nominee has announced with characteristic finality that he proposes to sweep from the government at Washington the cobwebs as he swept them from Albany following long tenure of Democratic administration. I am not an expert in cobwebs, but if my memory does not betray me, when the Democratic Party took over the government 16 years ago, even the spiders were too weak from starvation to weave or spin a cobweb in any department of the government of the United States. This is no partisan call. It is no appeal for the lust of office. It is no panoply of sophistries made to perpetuate or deny power to any political party. It is the swelling of human breasts with pride that God in His wisdom has given us the power and the opportunity to inaugurate a better world and a better society.
And now we take a look at the election that got Alben Barkley elected as vice president, as we like to do. The election of 1948. In this election, it was Harry Truman, running mate Alben Barkley, going up against the Republican Thomas E. Dewey and his running mate Earl Warren. And then there was a Dixiecrat. The Dixiecrat third-party candidate was Strom Thurmond, and he had his running mate of Fielding Wright. The electoral vote count was 303 for Truman and Barkley to Dewey's 189 to Thurmond's 39. 28 states were carried by Truman and Barkley, compared to 16 by Dewey and 4 by Thurmond. And the popular vote was 49.6% to 45.1% in favor of Truman and Barkley. You know, it is a major upset, no doubt, but it really was not like as hair-splittingly close as you may seem, especially with the electoral vote count. I mean, 303 to 189, I mean, it's a pretty big margin. Now, granted, Dewey definitely, he took, like, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. He took all those states. Now, Massachusetts went to Truman. And Rhode Island went to Truman. So, ironically enough. But yeah, and then like all the several Midwest states went fairly big. Like, for example, like North Dakota, South Dakota, that whole line there, that went to Dewey. But then all the majority of everything else, Texas, California, Washington State, Florida, all went to Truman. So, again, you're seeing some maps. You're seeing probably some campaign posters and that sort of thing. But this was the election of 1948 that got Harry Truman elected as president and Alben Barkley elected as vice president. There you go. Small wonder that in 1948, when Democrats seemed to be on the ropes and awaiting the knockout punch, Truman asked the popular Kentuckian to serve again as keynote speaker for the party's convention. Barkley's rousing defense of New Deal liberalism so stirred the delegates that Truman felt compelled to name the senator as his running mate. It was a decision the president would not regret. In fact, the pair proved to be a dynamic team. While Truman mercilessly assaulted the nation by train, Barkley audaciously captured the attention of the electorate by his novel use of the airplane. He flew 150,000 miles and delivered 250 speeches, providing an awesome display of vocal and physical powers. When the November tally was complete, Truman and Barkley had fashioned a major upset. On January 20th of 1949, Barkley stopped being a senator when fellow Kentuckian and Supreme Court Associate Justice Stanley F. Reed administered the oath of office that converted Barkley into the nation's 35th vice president. He was proud of the honor bestowed on him by his party's nomination and the people's votes, though he never made a fuss over the additional distinction that he was also the oldest man to enter into these duties. However, coping with obscurity, not age, had been the prerequisite of office before Barkley walked onto the stage. In fact, one of Barkley's more famous but unoriginal anecdotes, removed from his repertoire after he became vice president, told to a friend shortly before the 1948 convention, stated, "There once was a farmer who had 2 sons. Both boys showed great promise in early life, but the elder son went to sea, and the younger son was elected vice president, and neither had been heard of from since." Barkley and many of his contemporaries had good reason to stop joking about the vice presidency after he took the oath of office. Not only did the Kentuckian bring stature to the position, but the course of the president's life reminded the voters that Truman was the 3rd vice president to move up to the White House in the first 45 years of the 20th century. Over the years, the vice president had become more than just the Senate's presiding officer and tiebreaker and the president's replacement in time of tragedy. The office permitted its occupant to appoint a few Senate committees, sign congressional resolutions, select 5 candidates each for the Naval Academy and West Point, and represent the government on the Smithsonian Institution's Board of Regents. Truman wanted Barkley's legislative experience made available to the entire executive branch of government, and so insisted on Barkley's presence for each cabinet-level meeting. Also, when a congressional bill created the National Security Council, that important policy-making body included the vice president. Finally, Barkley's national fame and speaking abilities prompted the administration to use the vice president as its principal spokesman. One reporter calculated that in the first 8 months of 1949, Barkley traveled across the country to deliver 40 major addresses in support of the president's positions. This constant visibility in the national limelight turned Barkley's joke about the vice presidency on its ear. There's George chiming in the background, barking a little. Oh, George. Recognizing that Barkley brought extraordinary qualities to his post, President Truman ordered the heraldic branch of the U.S. Army to design a special seal and flag for the office of the vice president. These prestigious symbols, however, were not nearly so endearing as the title Barkley and his family gave to the office. One evening in the spring of 1949, he spent a quiet time with daughter Marion and grandson Stephen Truett. The conversation turned to the awkward address, Mr. Vice President, that people used when they met Barkley. 10-year-old Stephen thought Gramps should insert 2 E's between the initials VP to form Veep. At his next news conference, the proud grandfather told this story, and the reporters picked up and began to employ the title Veep when they wrote articles about the vice president. Unlike the symbols of office created by the heraldic branch, Barkley did not pass this label on to his successors. The Veep became a special sign for Barkley alone, and one that would be used with affection then and thereafter. As if Barkley had not broken enough new ground to alter permanently the importance and style of the vice presidency, he added another first. On July 8th of 1949, he attended a party given by the Clark Cliffords on board the White House yacht Margie. One of the guests, Jane Rucker Hadley, caught the attentions and later the affections of the Veep. Mrs. Hadley, vivacious, attractive, and charming, was the middle-aged widow of a St. Louis attorney and secretary for the Wabash Railroad. She had come to Washington for a brief vacation with her close friends, the Cliffords. The moonlit night and the strains of Some Enchanted Evening struck a romantic chord in the hearts of Jane and the Veep. Although Jane returned to St. Louis, Barkley's affinity for planes allowed him to woo her in a cross-country romance that every American faithfully followed in the daily press. This whirlwind courtship ended on November 18th of 1949 when Alben and Jane shared marriage vows in a simple ceremony before close friends and relatives. Thus, Barkley was the first vice president to wed while he held that office.
And the wedding of Vice President Alben Barkley to Mrs. Carlton Hadley, who now becomes the second lady of the USA. Big crowds greeted the 71-year-old bridegroom and his bride, whose obvious happiness set the seal on America's #1 romance.
The delicate nature of the vice presidency. Having served in the job, even if briefly, Harry Truman understood the delicate nature of the vice presidency, which he noted fell between the legislative and executive branches without being responsible to either. The vice president cannot become completely acquainted with the policies of the president, while the senators, for their part, look on him as a presiding officer only, who is outside the pale as far as the senatorial club is concerned. Despite being presiding officer, the vice president was hardly ever consulted about legislative matters. Although he could lobby for the president's legislation, he had nothing to trade for votes. Truman noted that the status of John Nance Garner had rested more on his position within the Democratic Party than on the vice presidency, while Henry Wallace was a party outsider who had little influence within the Senate. Alben Barkley, by contrast, was in a class by himself, declared Truman. He had the complete confidence of both the president and the Senate. Although new in the job, Barkley had long experience in dealing with vice presidents. He recalled how as a freshman senator in 1927, he had gone to the rostrum in the Senate chamber to chat with Vice President Charles Dawes, who said, "Barkley, this is a hell of a job I have as vice president." "What is the matter with it?" Barkley asked, to which Dawes replied, "I can do only two things here. One of them is to sit up here on this rostrum and listen to you birds talk without the ability to reply. The other is to look at the newspapers every morning to see how the president's health is." And I think it's actually pronounced rostrum. Rostrum, not rostrum. My apologies. As a party leader in the Senate, Alben Barkley had assessed the influence of several vice presidents over legislation and decided that the degree of influence depended on the person who held the office. Vice presidents with experience in the House or Senate could occasionally exercise some leverage on legislation. As an example, Barkley cited former House Speaker John Nance Garner as the vice president who exercised larger influence in the passage of legislation than any other occupant of the office. Garner assisted the passage of early New Deal legislation in an informal and entirely proper way, helping to speed emergency bills through the Senate. Barkley therefore declared that a vice president who is well liked by members of the Senate and by the corresponding members of the House in charge of legislation can exercise considerable power in the shaping of the program of legislation which every administration seeks to enact. Unlike some of his predecessors, Barkley was determined not to enter into a 4-year period of silence. He accepted hundreds of invitations to speak at meetings, conventions, banquets, and other partisan and nonpartisan programs. "I like to do it," he explained. "I like people, and I enjoy the thrill of crowds. I have always believed it to be the duty of those who are elected to high office by the people to take government to them whenever and by whatever legitimate means possible." Traveling almost exclusively by air, Barkley claimed to have spent more time in the air than all his predecessors combined. Having served 22 years as a member of the House and Senate and the past 12 as Democratic leader, he missed taking an active part in the debates in piloting legislation through to passage. He found that the office did not consume all his energies. Barkley constantly sought other activities to occupy his time, attending meetings of the Senate Democratic Policy Committee, legislative conferences with the president, and cabinet meetings. He was the first vice president to become a member of the National Security Council as provided by the National Security Act of 1947. "All these conferences I attend regularly," he said in 1952, noting that he enjoyed them and engaged freely in the discussions. Proud to be the presiding officer. Nevertheless, Alben Barkley was also the last vice president to preside regularly over the Senate. Senate parliamentarian Floyd Riddick estimated that Barkley presided between 50 and 75% of the time, a figure that seems incredibly high today, but which reflected the traditional concept of the vice president's constitutional responsibility. As one who presided routinely, Barkley also used the vice president's room outside the chamber as his working office. He was proud to occupy that historic room and liked to keep a wood fire burning in its fireplace, the smell of wood smoke reminding him of the open hearth in his childhood home. He also took pleasure in the furnishings and artworks of the room that were associated with famous names from the past. In the 81st Congress, which began in January of 1949, the Democrats enjoyed a 54-42 majority in the Senate. By the 82nd Congress, their margin had shrunk to 49-47. But in both of those Congresses, the real majority belonged to a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans. This conservative coalition had emerged out of the opposition to FDR's court-packing plan in 1937 and predominated in the Senate at least until the liberal Democratic sweep of Senate elections in 1958. During the Second World War and throughout the Truman administration, this conservative coalition frequently frustrated administration efforts to enact domestic reform legislation. President Truman had proposed an ambitious Fair Deal program to deal with national health insurance, farm supports, labor management relations, and civil rights. But the conservative coalition repeatedly derailed his legislative initiatives, often through the use of filibusters. In the field of civil rights, for instance, the president desegregated the armed forces through executive order, but had no luck in winning congressional approval of bills to outlaw the poll tax, make lynching a federal crime, or prohibit segregation and discrimination in interstate commerce. More typical of congressional attitudes at the time was the passage of a bill to authorize segregated schools on federal property, a bill which President Truman vetoed. Step by step, we are discarding old discriminations, he declared. We must not adopt new ones. The Senate overturned some of Vice President Barkley's rulings. Charles Watkins, who served as parliamentarian during Barkley's vice presidency, observed that, while Barkley was well acquainted with the Senate's rules, he would sometimes get them mixed up or become obstinate about how a rule should be applied. On a few occasions, Barkley persisted in his own interpretations of the rules in spite of Watkins' advice, only to have the Senate reverse his rulings, which dealt with efforts to enact civil rights legislation. Early in 1949, Barkley's successor as majority leader, Senator Scott Lucas of Illinois, attempted to amend the rules to make cloture easier to obtain as a way of ending a filibuster. Georgia Senator Richard Russell led the opposition to any rule changes that might favor civil rights legislation. In a procedural move and against the parliamentarians' advice, Barkley ruled against Russell's point of order, but the Senate, by a vote of 41 yeas to 46 nays, failed to sustain the chair's ruling. Barkley was apparently willing to take the risk of defeat, both because of his support for the administration's civil rights program and because of his own frustration at the Senate's inability to invoke cloture and end debate during his years as majority leader. As vice president, Barkley did what he could to help his successors as majority leader. Scott Lucas, who served from 1949 to 1951, and Ernest McFarland, who held the leadership from 1951 to 1953. Barkley continued to interpret the relationship between the vice president and the floor leader as that of a catcher and pitcher. With the divisions inside the ranks of the Democratic Party, however, as well as the rapidly diminishing popularity of the Truman administration, Barkley often watched his successors' pitches go wild. Lucas and McFarland were more legislative mechanics than floor leaders, and neither achieved Barkley's status or prestige in the post. As one journalist observed, they made the job of majority leader misery without splendor. Despite their leadership roles, Lucas and McFarland were each in turn defeated when they ran for re-election. Perhaps the sight of their increasing discomfort and distress may have added to Barkley's own comfort and pleasure in his position as presiding officer rather than floor leader. An activist vice president. As vice president, Alben Barkley tried to be as much of an activist as his office would allow. He was assisted by a sympathetic president who not only had held the job, but was a student of American government and history and thought seriously about how to enhance the vice presidency. By executive order, President Truman proclaimed a new coat of arms, seal, and flag for the vice president. "You can make 'em step aside now," Truman assured Barkley when the new symbols of office were unveiled. Truman also supported a raise in the vice president's salary and expenses. When Barkley celebrated his 38th anniversary of service in the legislative branch, President Truman paid a surprise visit to the Senate chamber to present to the vice president a gavel made from timber taken from the White House during its reconstruction. Barkley was deeply touched by the gesture. In accepting the gift, Barkley noted that President Truman frequently said that no president and vice president got along together as well as they did. The reason for this, Barkley told the Senate, is that I have let him have his way about everything. During the 1950 congressional campaign, which occurred after the United States had entered the Korean War, President Truman left the job of campaigning for Democratic candidates to Vice President Barkley, who barnstormed the nation. Although Barkley's party suffered losses, the Democrats retained their majorities in both houses of Congress. Yet despite his vigorous campaigning, it became evident that age was beginning to catch up with Alben Barkley. In 1950, the columnist Drew Pearson attended a dinner for the vice president at which the president, Chief Justice, and Speaker of the House were present. Barkley gave a brief speech and seemed a little old and tired, Pearson recorded in his private diary. It was about the first time that his speech wasn't all it usually is. Even though he was exempted from the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1951, that limited future presidents to 2 terms, Truman announced his decision not to seek a 3rd term. Vice President Barkley then sought the Democratic nomination for president, but his age and failing eyesight defeated his candidacy. Organized labor, which exerted great influence within the Democratic Party organization, openly opposed his nomination because he was too old. Although deeply hurt, Barkley accepted the decision and withdrew from the race. He was invited to deliver a farewell address to the convention and did so with characteristic grace and style, celebrating the democratic crusade that he had helped to lead to ensure a happier and fuller life to all mankind in the years that lie before us. When he bid the convention goodbye, the delegates awarded him a 45-minute ovation, demonstrating the enormous affection that the party felt for him, even as they denied him his heart's desire. Not all the accomplishments and activities Barkley undertook as vice president acquired the sympathetic interest of the nation. In his traditional and constitutional function as the Senate's presiding officer, the Veep more than once engaged in controversies that mirrored beliefs and principles he had long held and also shared with the administration. The most publicly disputed act Barkley performed occurred in March of 1949. He ruled on a motion to end a 10-day filibuster conducted by Southern senators who opposed a civil rights bill then being considered. Technically, the motion, not the legislation, caused a bitter debate, and both sides had quoted Barkley extensively to buttress their views. The Veep's decision on the motion placed him squarely on the side of those legislators who strove to implement civil rights, but before he presented his emotion-packed ruling, he led off with an anecdote. "The chair," Barkley said, "feels somewhat like the man who was being ridden out of town on a rail. Someone asked him how he liked it. He said if it weren't for the honor of the thing, he would just as soon walk." Barkley's peers marked his ruling as scurrilous or statesmanlike, depending on their position. But few senators could sustain any genuine hatred for a man who so deftly encapsulated a potentially distasteful ruling in a syrup of digestible humor. Fortunately for the Veep's emotional stability, most of his chores in the Senate could be quietly performed or tactfully and wittily fulfilled without arousing the rancor that occurred over the civil rights motion. Congress responded to Barkley's masterful charm by awarding him a special gold medallion for his service, and on March 1st of 1951, the 38th anniversary of his first year in Congress, President Truman made a surprise visit to the Senate chamber to honor the Veep. Truman carried a special gavel for the Senate's president, a gavel fashioned from the ancient timbers of the renovated White House. Despite his unique role, executive knowledge, and high visibility, Barkley's age, 74, prevented his dark horse candidacy for president from reaching the finish line during the 1952 convention. January 1953 found Barkley unemployed and without political office for the first time in nearly a half-century. After a brief stint with his own national television show, Meet the Veep, Barkley and his bride retired to their Angles estate in Paducah, Kentucky, where he wrote his memoirs with the assistance of journalist Sidney Shallett. Retirement, however, did not suit Barkley, and perhaps to redress the too old label that had ended his 1952 candidacy for president, he entered the 1954 Senate race, defeating Republican incumbent John Sherman Cooper by 80,000 votes. Barkley relished his return to Congress as a freshman legislator, though his colleagues honored him with an appointment to the prestigious Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He also remained a popular, much sought-after speaker. Thus, on April 30th of 1956, he traveled to Lexington, Virginia, to give a keynote speech before a mock convention conducted by students at Washington and Lee University. At the conclusion of his address, he suffered a fatal heart attack, dying as he had lived, in the public arena. He was buried in Paducah. Return from retirement. Alben Barkley retired to Kentucky, but could not stay retired for long. In 1954, he ran once again for a seat in the Senate against the incumbent Republican Senator John Sherman Cooper. Campaigning always seemed to invigorate him, and he swept back into office by a comfortable margin. His victory helped return the Senate Democrats to a one-vote majority and made Lyndon Johnson majority leader. 2 years later, in 1956, students at Washington and Lee University invited Senator Alben Barkley to deliver the keynote address at their mock convention. He accepted and gave one of his classic rip-snorting, Republican-bashing, Democratic-praising orations. At its conclusion, he reminded his audience that after all of his years in national politics, he had become a freshman once again, but that he had declined an offer of a front row seat with other senior senators. "I'm glad to sit on the back row," he declared, "for I would rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than to sit in the seats of the mighty." Then, with the applause of the crowd in his ears, Alben Barkley collapsed and died from a massive heart attack. For an old-fashioned orator, there could have been no more appropriate final exit from the stage. Clearly, Alben Barkley enjoyed being Vice President of the United States. Although he missed the opportunity to speak out, maneuver, and vote on bills as he had as Senator and Majority Leader, he enjoyed promoting the President's legislative program. He also savored the thrill of the crowds that a Vice President can attract, relished performing the ceremonial duties, and delighted in the prestige of national office. "I hope the Vice Presidency continues to hold the respect of the American people," he said. "The qualifications for it are the same as for the presidency itself. They have to be, for he may become the president in case of a death or disability. The best way for vice presidents to retain respect," he concluded, "was to deserve it. I have always felt that public officers should lean backwards in the performance of their official duties because, to a larger extent than many people realize, they are looked upon as examples of probity and propriety in dealing with public matters. It will be a sad day for this country and its institutions if and when the people lose confidence in their public servants." For his part, Alben Barkley retained public confidence, even public affection, throughout his long career in the legislative branch, and for 4 years cast the vice presidency in a highly positive light. So, just a couple other things regarding Barkley I wanted to touch on. There was something I read here that during the 1950 midterm elections, when he was out campaigning, Barkley traveled over 19,000 miles and spoke in almost half of the states during the campaign. Barkley felt ill when he arrived in Paducah, Kentucky on Election Day, and a doctor diagnosed him with a tired heart. Returning to Washington, D.C., he spent several days in the Bethesda Naval Hospital, but was able to preside when the Senate opened its session on November 28th. Democrats lost seat in both houses, but maintained majorities in each. In November of 1951, Barkley and his wife ate Thanksgiving dinner with U.S. troops at Kimpo Air Base in Seoul. On his 74th birthday, Barkley traveled to the front lines on a fact-finding mission for the president. On June 4th of 1952, he cast another notable tie-breaking vote to save the Wage Stabilization Board. The Wage Stabilization Board, it was a tie-breaking vote, June 4th, 1952. Let me see what else I got here. Barkley joined the Broadway Methodist Episcopal Church, where he was a lay preacher, and several fraternal organizations, including Woodmen of the World, but the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks, the Independent Order of Oddfellows, and the Improved Order of Red Men. On June 23rd of 1903, he married Dorothy Brower. They had 3 children, David, Marion, and Laura Louise. Laura Louise married Douglas MacArthur II, a U.S. diplomat and nephew of General Douglas MacArthur. Barkley's term as vice president ended on January 20th of 1953. After the election, he had surgery to remove his cataracts. He contracted with NBC to create 26 15-minute commentary broadcasts called Meet the Veep. Low ratings prompted NBC's decision not to renew the series in September of 1953. In retirement, Barkley remained a popular speaker and began working on his memoirs with journalist Sidney Shallett. He re-entered politics in 1954, challenging incumbent Republican Senator John Sherman Cooper. In a 1971 study of Barkley's Senate career, historian Glenn Finch argued that Barkley was the only person who could beat Cooper. Few issues differentiated the candidates, and the campaign hinged on party politics. Visits to Kentucky by President Eisenhower, Vice President Richard Nixon, and Illinois Senator Everett Dirksen on Cooper's behalf reinforced this notion. Barkley resumed his Iron Man campaign style, campaigning for up to 16 hours a day, countering the too-old charge that cost him the 1952 Democratic presidential nomination. He won the general election by a vote of 434,109 to 362,948, giving Democrats a one-vote advantage in the Senate. Veteran West Virginia Senator Harley M. Kilgore offered to exchange seats with Barkley, putting Barkley on the front row with the chamber's senior members and himself on the back row with the freshman legislators, but Barkley declined the offer. In honor of his previous service, he was assigned to the prestigious Committee on Foreign Relations. In this position, he endorsed Eisenhower's appointment of Cooper as U.S. ambassador to India and Nepal. His relative lack of seniority did not afford him much influence. Barkley did not sign the 1956 Southern Manifesto. In an April 30th, 1956 keynote address at the Washington and Lee Mock Convention, Barkley spoke of his willingness to sit with the other freshman senators in Congress. He ended with an allusion to Psalm 84:10, saying, "I'm glad to sit on the back row, for I would rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than to sit in the seats of the mighty." He then collapsed on stage and died of a heart attack. He was buried in Mount Kenton Cemetery near Paducah. His legacy, a dam constructed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on the Cumberland River in 1966, and the lake it forms were named Barkley Dam and Lake Barkley in Barkley's honor. Barkley Regional Airport in Paducah is also named for him. In 1984, the federal government declined to purchase the Angles, his Paducah home, and it was sold at auction. Many personal items owned by Barkley are displayed on the second floor of the historic house, Whitehaven in Paducah. In February of 2008, Paducah's American Justice School of Law changed owners after failing to secure accreditation from the American Bar Association. It was renamed the Alben W. Barkley School of Law, but remained unaccredited and closed in December of 2008. So what I want to show you guys now is just some video clips, of course, of Barkley. I like to do that, like just maybe like a little speech type thing. And then I want you to listen to the entire speech. It is about 25 minutes long, but the speech where the last speech he ever gives, and you can actually hear him, fainting and having the heart attack at the end of the speech. So first, here's some video clips of Barkley. Take a look here.
I can't prove, do you? All right. And as we approach the presidential campaign of 1956, we know, you know, the American people know, and the Republican Party knows that it must run on its own record now, and not on the record with somebody else. I am deeply grateful for all the honors that have been conferred upon me by the people of Kentucky, by the United States Senate, and by the President. But there are two things more precious to me than any of these: the rectitude of my conscience and my self-respect. I have today tried to maintain them both.
Washington awaits the crowning moment of its greatest inaugural celebration. Well over 1 million spectators crowded every vantage point as President Truman drove in state to the Capitol, and Washington gave him a hero's welcome. Beneath the Great Dome, two firm friends and colleagues, President Truman and Vice President Barkley, are ready to be sworn in. Mr. Truman solemnly takes the oath which binds him to a tremendous task.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The new term of office had officially begun, and now the city turned to carnival mood as the President led a big parade. Mr. Truman's old Army comrades of World War I formed a guard of honor for the man they still call Captain. Also, in a place of honor, the West Point cadets represented the Army of Tomorrow. From the saluting base, the President watched the rest of a 7-mile-long procession, a moving panorama of American life. Loyal supporters and political opponents alike joined in a national salute to the former Missouri farm boy who became first citizen of the USA. In Harry Truman, Americans put their trust for the 4 years to come.
Pretty cool stuff. And now, let's take a listen to the actual speech that took place on April 30th of 1956. This was the speech at, William and Lee? Is that what it was? No, I'm sorry, Washington and Lee. At Washington and Lee University, this mock convention speech, April 30th, 1956. Here it is. You can fast forward if you would like, but I definitely suggest listening at least to the last 3 minutes or so of this. So here, take a listen here.
On the afternoon of April 30th, 1956, a man who belied his 78 years was riding in a convertible at the head of a parade through the streets of the small town of Lexington, Virginia. Less than 2 hours later, that man was dead. His name, Alben W. Barkley, Senator from Kentucky. Senator Barkley was in Lexington to deliver the keynote address at Washington and Lee University's mock Democratic Convention. The afternoon was warm. The senator turned to one of his companions in the automobile in which he was riding and said, "This is one of the happiest days of my life." After the parade, the convention was called to order in Convention Hall on the Washington and Lee campus. The secretary read the call for the convention. The mayor of Lexington gave an address of welcome, and Virginia's Governor Thomas B. Stanley introduced the keynote speaker. More than 1,000 student delegates stood, cheered, and applauded for almost 2 minutes. And then Alben W. Barkley began his last speech.
Governor Stanley, my fellow Americans, and by the same token, my fellow Democrats. I feel very highly honored, of course. By being chosen as your keynoter and your temporary chairman. I hope that my remarks and my appearance and my chairmanship may receive the same approval after I've finished that I have had before I start. It may be that I owe an explanation to Washington and Lee for having attended the law school of the University of Virginia. I have one to give you. I was nurtured in the cradle of Jeffersonian democracy. I grew up in the same sort of atmosphere in the memory of Andrew Jackson. And I really studied democracy at the feet of Woodrow Wilson. Mrs. Barkley and I are very happy to be here today, to be your guests, and to be allowed to say a few words on this occasion. As the governor has said, I have been a delegate at large from the state of Kentucky from 1920 until this hour. I have been temporary chairman of 3 of them, permanent chairman of 1, and took some part in all of them. And I had about concluded that maybe I had gone to enough conventions and I would not go to the one in Chicago this year. But since arriving in Lexington and since arriving in this hall, the old fire horse hears the bell. I'll be on my way. It is not easy to draw a picture of a great political party that has existed during the entire history of the United States, as has the Democratic Party. There has never been an election since 1800 when the author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and the founder of the University of Virginia was elected president. There has never been a year or an election since that time when the Democratic Party was not the voice of the people crying from the wilderness in behalf of these same people and the cause which they represent. Somebody asked me the other day, what is the difference between the Democratic and Republican parties? And my answer is the difference between progress and stagnation. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson stated that the Republican Party had not had a new idea in 40 years. That was 44 years ago, making 84 years in all. Why do I say that? I say it because I can with truth ask you here today, or any other convention of either Democrats or Republicans, to name one single great constructive statute that's on the books of the law today that was initiated or inaugurated by the Republican Party. And as we approach the presidential campaign of 1956, we know, you know, the American people know, and the Republican Party knows that it must run on its own record now, and not on the record of somebody else. It was under the administration of Grover Cleveland that the first rural mail route in America was established. It was under Grover Cleveland that the first act to regulate commerce, creating the Interstate Commerce Commission, was enacted into law. Now that's going a long way back, but you want the foundations, don't you, for what I said a moment ago? You don't want me to say anything here today that I can't prove, do you? All right. It was under the administration of Woodrow Wilson that the great Federal Reserve System was established, which enabled us to finance two great wars in the last generation. It was under the administration of Woodrow Wilson that the Federal Trade Commission was set up to give a forum where business, large and small, might find a redress for its grievances.
I might say that a great Virginian who served in the House and in the Senate and in the Cabinet, of whom I was fond indeed, was one of the constructors of that great economic and financial legislation, the Honorable Carter Glass. It was under the administration of Woodrow Wilson that the greatest tariff law ever enacted in our history was enacted in the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Law of 1913, which was described as the fairest tariff ever enacted in the history of this nation. And it is the only one of the great record of Woodrow Wilson's enactments that the Republicans have ever repealed. And when they repealed that, they brought on a worldwide, nationwide panic from which it took the Democratic Party to rescue this nation in 1933. It was the Democratic Party that enacted the Clayton Antitrust Law, bringing down to date and up to date the antitrust laws of our country to protect the American people against monopolies and trusts. It was the Democratic Party that first enacted a highway law to give aid by the government of the United States to our states and counties in the building of highways. And that law has been in effect from 1916 until now. And now all the items our administration has been able to do has been ask us to extend that law and build more highways, and we're going to build more than he asked us to build them. It was the Democratic Party that established the Department of Labor and appointed the first Secretary of Labor in the cabinet of the President of the United States. It was under the leadership of Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party that the amendment to the Constitution giving the women of this nation the right to vote came into effect in 1920. I never thought that woman suffrage would bring the millennium, but it couldn't have made it any worse than it was before. Then came World War I. Following World War I, it was the great Democratic President of the United States who tried to bring about peace in the world and to organize mankind for peace instead of war. He gave his life for that cause. And our great domestic program was interfered with by the war. And then came the Republicans. Which were worse than the war. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. Now I don't mention those names through any disrespect. For I have respect for anybody elected President of the United States. But I do have to mention them because they did live and they were president. the end of their 12 years, the American people were in the depths of the greatest economic and social and moral depression in the history of this nation. And then what happened? The American people did what they always do when they get in trouble. They called on the Democratic Party to relieve them from that Franklin D. Roosevelt became the President of the United States. During his administration, more laws were enacted for the benefit of the American people than were ever enacted in any 50 years of our history prior to that time. I need not here recite them, but I mention merely the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, known as the AAA, which lifted the farmer out of the ditch and put his feet on solid ground. And it is a strange similarity that today that same farmer is in the same ditch, and the Democrats are going to have to lift him out and put him on solid ground if he gets out of It was the same Democratic Party that enacted the law guaranteeing bank deposits of the people of the United States. During the 12 years to which I've just referred, bank failures were occurring everywhere, all over the nation. Due to our foresight, due to our courage, due to the constructive ability of the Democratic Party, we enacted a new banking law and guaranteed the deposits of our people so that they now have faith in their banks, and so long as they have faith in their banks, there'll be no runs on our banks and no bank failures. It was the Democratic Party that gave to the nation and to the world, and particularly to the Western Hemisphere, the good neighbor policy of Cordell Hull, one of the greatest secretaries of state in the history of the United States. Under former Republican administrations, we had what was called dollar diplomacy, by which was meant our ambassadors That's only a symbol of what's going to happen to the Republicans in November. During previous Republican administrations, we'd had what was called dollar diplomacy, which meant that our ambassadors to our neighbors in South and Central America were sent there largely to exploit those people for the dollars of American investors and American businessmen. Cordell Hull, from Tennessee, who married a Virginia girl, brought about the new neighbor, the good neighbor policy with our neighbors to the south. And to show you that the Republicans are trying under a guise of originality to keep the same thing but give it a different name, a couple of weeks ago, they unveiled a bust of Cordell Hull in the Pan American Union building in Washington. The distinguished gentleman who unveiled and made a speech about it was unwilling to call it a good neighbor policy because it was democratic. He renamed it the good partner policy. They've renamed everything, but they've kept it. Now we have the good neighbor policy with our Central and South American neighbors. And when we were for the second time drawn into a world war which we had not caused against our will, every one of these American republics joined us in our fight to preserve democracy, freedom, the dignity of man. Every great constructive legislative enactment that has found its way to the statutes of the American Congress in the last 50 years was put there by the Democratic Party, recommended by Democratic presidents. Therefore, I say without any equivocation that the Democratic Party has been the forward-looking, progressive, constructive party in the history of our nation. And it will be, as the world goes on now in its great economic struggle to preserve democracy, to hand our nation down to those who are to come after in the generations to come, free and strong. Democratic Party fighting for the rights of the great masses of our people and not for any particular group of our people. The great founder of our party was an apostle of equal rights to all and exclusive privileges to none. We are for all kinds of business so long as it's honest, big or little. We are those who feel that after all, in our economic struggle and in the complexity of our lives, government cannot be indifferent to the welfare of all classes of our people. And therefore we have a foreign policy, we have a domestic policy. We have a farm policy, we have a labor policy. We have an old age policy, we have a youth policy. We are not like the Republicans who only have one policy, and that's an insurance policy that insures you for what you need and pays you off and everything you've got more of than you need. We have an amplitude of worthy material, half a dozen or more, any one of whom would grace the White House and honor the American people with his service. So, my friends, I'm not going to test your patience by holding you off much longer from the real business of this convention. I want to announce to you, though, and if I had not known it in advance, I would have known it when I saw all the floats in the great parade which you put on, but I am myself not a candidate. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, yes, yes. I have been in years gone by, I think that I am sufficiently alert to present conditions to know that all fire apparatus now are automotive and not horse-drawn. I have seen the time when I was like old Thomas B. Reed of Maine, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives back in 1896, when William McKinley was nominated, and he was a candidate. He was known as the Czar Reed. Some of you students have heard about Czar Reed. He became known as Czar Reed because he was so arbitrary and ruthless in his rulings as the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was a candidate for the nomination of the Republican Party for president in 1896. He was getting a very good vote, but not enough. Finally, a member of the House came up to the stand and said, "Mr. Speaker, do you think they're going to nominate you out there?" "Well," he said, "my friend, by George, they could go further and do worse, and I'm afraid they will." But I have no longer any personal interest. I have served my country and my people for half a century as a Democrat. I went to the House of Representatives in 1913 and served 14 years. I was a junior congressman. Then I became a senior congressman. And then I went to the Senate and became a junior senator. And then I became a senior senator. And then majority leader of the Senate. And then vice president of the United States. And now I'm back again as a junior senator. I am willing to be a junior. I am glad to sit on the back row, for I would rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than to sit in the seats of the mighty.
Senator Barkley just collapsed as he finished saying, "I had rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than in the seat of the mighty."
You're a doctor? Somebody call for a doctor.
Senator Barkley has just collapsed on the platform. He is being fanned by the chairman of the convention. A doctor has been summoned. Delegates are standing. There is just an air of disbelief.
That is absolutely unbelievable. That's mind-boggling. I mean, you can literally hear when he passes out and basically dies of a fatal heart attack. You can even hear in that audio somebody in the crowd there says, "Get a doctor," or "Call a doctor." Absolutely unbelievable. And that is literally when he dies. That's not an exaggeration like, oh, he died a day or two later in a hospital. No, he that was it. Fatal heart attack right there on stage. So crazy stuff. And then last but not least, guys, just a couple pictures you're seeing now on your screen. My visit to the Mount Kenton Cemetery in Paducah, Kentucky, where Alben Barkley is buried. Again, a very modest grave, says Barkley, has his name, his birth date, and death date. There's really nothing else. There's no, mention really of the vice presidency. There is a sign outside of the cemetery that, mentions that he's in this cemetery and vice presidency and such, but The grave itself does not. So interesting, very modest grave. So there you go, guys. Now stay tuned. Part 2 bonus footage. I will show you all of my photos from my visit to the Mount Kenton Cemetery in Paducah, Kentucky. So take a look at those in bonus footage. And I hope you enjoyed this look at our 35th Vice President of the United States, Alben Barkley. Very cool stuff. Thank you for all you guys do. Thank you for the subscribes. Keep them coming. The comments and questions, keep those coming. All of it. Can't thank you guys enough. And believe it or not, guys, next week, because we're going to be skipping over Richard Nixon, who technically is the 36th Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, who's the 37th Vice President. We skip over them because we've already done presidential series installments on them. So we're going to be going all the way ahead next week to the 38th Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey. So yeah, we're already up to the 38th Vice President next week. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. And we will see you next week. Bye-bye now.